By August 1901, in an attempt to reduce the vibrations, the weight of the engine was managed to be reduced by 10 tons, but more needed to be done to save the rails, and a long-term solution was desperately needed. Luckily, an American inventor called Frank Sprague came to the rescue. He was extremely talented with electrical equipment, and by the turn of the century, over 110 railway companies around the globe were incorporating his products. He was brought out by Thomas Edison, who wanted to use Mark's developments for electric elevators. It sounded a little weird venture to go in, but as the skyscraper boom hit America, soon the lift mechanisms, being lighter and smaller than hydraulic, were highly sought after. Frank thought laterally, quite literally, about the lifts he created and turned the mechanism 90 degrees horizontal. For what was once a control for lift operations had now become an electrical multiple control engine. Each carriage would carry its own electric motor, the third rail would provide the power, and the driver would command all the individual motors to act together. Frank converted 4 existing carriages to carry a 100 horsepower motor on each of the carriage's leading bogie. They were much smaller and lighter, and the vibration issues disappeared overnight. In addition, the new arrangement eliminated the need to turn the leading engine around, and the train could be driven at either end. In just 2 years, the entire underground network was replaced with these new units, and steam-hauled traction was ultimately eliminated. The interior of the carriages also received an overhaul. Originally, the carriages' seating were made from wood, and little was thought to comfort, especially amongst the lower classes. The seating was replaced with a rattan weave, and the carriages were smartly painted in brown and white, with central London painted on the sides. All that was recognisable from the old style were the gates that you used to enter the carriage, as an alternative solution had yet to be developed. Even though steam was eliminated on the network, the new trains were just as labour-intensive to drive. A crew of 8 people were needed per train to run it effectively. The driver and his assistant would drive the train, the front and rear guard to look after the passengers, and 4 gatemen to attend to the gates and shout the station names. It was a very complicated, and even starting the train alone was a logistical challenge. When the train was ready to go, the gateman had to face forward, signalling his gate was shut. The rear guard would watch for each of the gateman's signals, and only when all of the gatemen showed all of their signals would he give the green signal to the front guard. The front guard in turn would then signal the driver, and only then would the train get underway. Can you imagine doing this on today's underground? It'd be a mess. After 1905, after a slump in passenger numbers due to the increase in motorcar power, the Central Line decided to increase its prices for the first time. Any passenger travelling 8 stations or more would have to pay 3D rather than 2D. And further extensions were added to various exhibition areas, and the network played a major part in ferrying people to and from the London Olympic Games when it was held in 1908. After the death of Queen Victoria in 1901, London turned to the Edwardian era. The era was full of new inventions, new discoveries, and new ways and means to travel that made the world a whole lot smaller. The first tube line to be built in the Edwardian era, the Great Northern and City Railway, was unique among the other lines on the network. It was the first subterranean line that could accommodate a full-size stock since the Underground's creation, and the tunnels were much larger at 16 foot in diameter. The line was sponsored by Great Northern Railway, who already had a main line from the East Coast to King's Cross, but wanted a more direct route into the heart of the city. As with other railways, the Great Northern was not allowed surface routes, so looked to take its route underground. The plan was to take steam-hauled topside trains, which would leave the main line at Finsbury Park, and allow them to run the underground lines to Moorgate, but remove the steam-hauled train at Drayton Park to be taken over by electric-hauled locomotives. The line had received parliamentary approval many years before, in 1892, but it took over 10 years to complete just the main tube section. By then, the Great Northern had lost interest and money and crucially removed all the rights for any train leaving the main line at Finsbury Park. This left it an independent line with a terrible interchange. Just 1 year after it was completed, the failed line was bought and merged into the vast Metropolitan network. The Metropolitan never developed the line, but kept it independent for a time before the nationalisation. The line's original objective was finally realised though, over 70 years later. While the underground was now mostly electric hauled, the subsurface lines needed a large overhaul. In a rare alliance, the Metropolitan and the District agreed to trial and share the cost of an experimental electric train between Earl's Court and Kensington. Provided by the Siemens Electric Traction Company, the train was successful in proving that electrification was needed on these lines, but the companies agreed not to proceed with the system that was trialled. It was recommended that a 3,000-volt three-phase overhead cabling system was recommended, as it was a cheaper solution than the third rail. Just as the Metropolitan had sealed the deal, the district's owner, Charles Yerkes, turned down the idea in favour of a lower voltage direct current arrangement. The Metropolitan challenged the idea, taking the district to court, but ultimately the district won. As the lines had to strive for uniformity, the Metropolitan had no option but to accept the decision and go quiet. Yerkes further offered insult by offering to buy the Metropolitan out. The company refused, and after electrifying the line with the system the district specified, they clearly stated they were not going anywhere by building their own power station at Neasden. The district's power conversion was completed by 1905, and a huge power station was built near Chelsea on Lots Road. The station was conveniently situated next to the Thames, so coal can be on constant supply to feed the massive boilers inside. Not to be outdone by the Metropolitan, the power station was the largest not only in the UK, but in Europe. Yerkes is pivotal in the network we see today and was instrumental in the construction of the Bakerloo, Piccadilly and Northern lines. The 3 new lines already received parliamentary backing, but the lines were not seen as financially viable. Yerkes was originally a bond dealer from the Americas, but lost everything when his bonds literally went up in flames in the Great Fire in Chicago and the insurance companies defaulted. He was later jailed for embezzling funds upon his release, he got involved in developing the Chicago tramway and making his fortune back through rather scrupulous dealings. These dealings may have made him money, but ruined his reputation, and he was ultimately forced to leave Chicago to look for transport ventures elsewhere. Yerkes did not move to the UK straight away. He tried his luck in New York, where he indulged in fine dining in a Park Avenue mansion with a string of mistresses. It was here that he was contacted by R.W. Perks, the solicitor of the Metropolitan line, and persuaded him to finance the electrification of the district lines. Yerkes had already had a large stake in the district line and knew it was the time to turn its now crumbling lines into profitability, as well as build the 3 deep proposed lines. He first worked on Baker Street and the Waterloo Railway. It was planned to be 3 miles long with stations at Oxford and Piccadilly, but before it was even built, the line had a terrible past. The line was going to be financed originally by Whittaker Wright, an English millionaire who had struck gold in the Old West. He approached the managers and offered to invest £700,000 on the line. The money, which were in shares in the London and Company Globe Finance Company, never materialised. The finance company went bankrupt in just 18 months into the project, leaving Wright penniless. Work stopped as the contractors demanded to be paid, and Wright fled the country. He was caught in New York and hauled back to London to face the courts. The courts, finding that Wright had conned millions out of multiple businesses and people alike, was sentenced to 7 years in prison. But seconds after the sentence was read, Wright collapsed and died on the stand after taking a cyanide pill. Yerkes quickly took control and bought the line outright in 1902. After completing the Bakerloo line, Yerkes completed the Charing Cross, Euston and Hampstead line, employing the same business tactics as he used in Chicago. He exploited the affluent suburban parts of London and the real estate potential with the line running under the Heath, and the station at Hampstead was, and still is, the deepest platform on the network, 192 feet. Within 5 years, the Northern Piccadilly and Bakerloo lines were well established, serving 38 stations and 50 overground buildings. The overground stations were designed by Leslie W. Green, and many survive and are still in use today, and were elaborately decorated with distinctive red tiling and stunning brickwork inside. Sadly, many of the intricate details were destroyed, but remnants of the decoration can be seen at Holloway Road, and Regis Park platform has recently been restored to its Edwardian glory. Having updated his station and created the lines, Yerkes looked back to the trains themselves and their operations. Having 8 people to operate one train was far too uneconomical, but centrally located locking doors were not available, and the passengers were preferring to stand in the breeze and the cooler of the gateman's platform rather than in the stuffy and hot coaches. This made the trains late, as the gateman had to circumnavigate the crowds of people just to give the all clear signal. Yerkes decided to replace the hand signals with a system of ringing bells, which would pass through the train to the front guard. Then the front guard heard the bell. It was him who would then signal the driver to start the engine. The system allowed for the trains to depart much quicker, and the role of the gateman was becoming more and more redundant. In 1903, a terrible fire raged through the Paris metro, through its old wooden carriages. The passengers raced from the flames, only to be caught in a crush, resulting in the deaths of 84 people. The UK Board of Trade called Yerkes to them and concluded that his trains must be made from steel with as little wooden features as possible. Yerkes, hearing of the devastation, agreed and started to import steel-made carriages from the USA, with some carriages being made in Germany and Hungary. The tube lines also received a further upgrade with a new automatic signalling system, which would indicate a train in section and stop a train dead in its tracks if it passed a red signal. Finally, the elevators were upgraded on all 3 lines. London owes a massive debt to Yerkes and his fellow investors. If it wasn't for them, the London Underground system simply wouldn't have worked. It was very lucky to have such an esteemed line of backers and a wealth of collective information. Yerkes sadly never got to see these 3 lines working. He passed away from kidney disease in 1905. But if it wasn't for him, many of the tubes and stations we use today would just be a drawing on a piece of paper gathering dust in some forgotten archive. Next, we look at Stanley and Pick, the pair that had to pick up the pieces where Yerkes left off. And we head up to the start of the First World War, and how the underground played a huge role in transporting the needy and keeping people safe.